Wow, that's quite a start. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Brett Stuart to come upstage. Brett?
Quebec City. Father of five. Yes, I said father of five. Brett is the president and co-founder of Global Agri-Trends, a firm that provides global ag research, analysis, and forecasting to a variety of clients around the world. Formerly economist for the U.S. Meat Export Federation, he has conducted numerous projects in the global meat trade area, as well as advising government representatives on international trade issues. Brett was raised on a cattle ranch and obtained degrees from Utah State University and University of Nebraska. Brett, welcome again. The floor is yours for the next 40 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci de vous joindre à moi pour accueillir Brett.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vincent. I appreciate that introduction. It's an honor for me to be here with you today to speak at the 6th Le Porc show here in Quebec City. I love to come to Quebec City. I don't know how many times I've been here, but it seems like almost every time I'm here, it's winter. So I guess that's okay. I live in Idaho. I'm not here seeking refugee status, not yet. Anyway, my wife is Canadian, so I always have a route back to Canada. But I do a lot of work here in Canada. I have a big story for you today, a very big story. The last year has been incredible. I stood here 1 year ago and talked about African swine fever in China. 1 year ago, we had no idea what that meant. The Chinese government said, it's not too much of a problem, a few cases here and there, we will be okay. Fast forward 1 year, we still don't know a lot, but we know much, much more than we did last year. And the impact of African swine fever is going to affect all of your industries for years. So what I will talk about today is the situation of African swine fever, how that's affecting the global protein markets, the situation in China. I want to talk, the one question I get more than any, why are prices so low if China's buying so much pork? Where is China in the markets? And then also talk about forecasts into 2020, which is very difficult right now. So as we begin to follow African swine fever, it began in China in August 2018. I had to go back over my newsletters to see what we had wrote about it. Nobody knew. We know what African swine fever is. We knew it was the worst hog disease in the world. In China, you have 50% of the world's swine on 3% of the world's land. We knew that would be a big problem. It has been enormously difficult to get good information, good data, trustworthy data. It's still difficult. I've been to China 3 times this year trying to get information. It's not easier to get information over there either. People are very, very cautious to talk about the ASF situation in China. So, key things to understand on why ASF is a global game changer. One, the virus is very resilient. It's a very difficult virus to kill. The virus can last active almost 3 years in frozen meat. The virus can last 300 days in dried sausage, the kind of dried sausage that Chinese tourists bring to the US and Canada. It's a very difficult virus to kill. Also, the mortality rates approach 95%. That's a bad disease. The real problem is there's no vaccine. So without a vaccine, this disease continues. It's very difficult to get it out of the Chinese system. In China, they share infrastructure. They share feed mills, they share trucks, they share packing plants all over. Over 42 million hog farms in China, all sharing the same infrastructure. You can see why this is such a disaster. Today, with 50% of the swine in China, 25% of the swine in Europe, 75% of the world's swine herd is now at risk of ASF. Chinese pork represents 20% of total global protein consumption. That means everything is going to be impacted. Beef is going to be impacted. Poultry is going to be impacted from this situation. And the losses are absolutely massive. Not just in China and Vietnam, now the losses are growing very quickly in the Philippines. So, it's got to be true. I found it on the internet, right? Attributed to Buddha. 3 things cannot long be hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. And I think that's what we've seen over the last 3 months in China. So the current situation, Asia is falling. New cases in Philippines, new cases of wild boar in Korea, although the Korean officials have effectively stopped the initial outbreak in their domestic farms. They continue to find wild boar cases. Europe is fighting. Belgium has seen reduced cases. Belgium may be able to stamp this out. They continue, but they've been very, very aggressive. Like the Koreans, they took a very aggressive action towards ASF. Everyone is fearing, us included. I'm pleased to see the collaboration between the Canadian and U.S. industries. I know our industries are working very closely to do everything we can do to try and prepare and to ensure that we do not bring the virus here. But it is very, very scary. So here's the OIE disease map. Here's where the virus is over the last 6 months. The green dots and orange dots are wild boar. The red and blue dots are domestic hog farms. Now this is what's reported. You can see how Vietnam has reported enormously of ASF. China has still reported less than 200 cases. Here's the virus map for Europe. Most disturbing, most concerning for Europe is the jump initially to Belgium a year ago, and now just in the last 3 weeks, the jump to Western Poland. If you look at the P on Poland, there's a green dot. The virus just jumped 250 miles westward. It's now 25 miles from the German border. Germany is 17% of China's pork imports. It's 20% of Korea's pork imports. Those markets would close immediately were Germany to find a wild boar with ASF. Denmark has completed the wall. They built a wall with Germany. The problem is trying to get the Germans to pay for it, right? But they build a wall to keep the swine out of Denmark, but trucks are continually going back and forth. Europe is at serious risk of ASF. Because of the wild boar, it's impossible to manage. So what does this do to the markets? Here's the global hog price. China can now outbid anyone for pork. They can outbid Japan. China has 10 times the population of Japan, and now, if they want to, they can go out on the global markets and they can bid pork away from Japan. Japan imports 50% of their pork consumption. This is terrifying to the Japanese, but to everyone. China's prices are so high now, this is not going to change. They can outbid all global supplies. If I take everyone off the chart there except China and US, that's the USDA weighted average price, the 201 price. You can see there, this is incredible. Now, as an economist, you would look at this and say, spreads don't stay wide for a long time. Eventually they close. Either pork goes to China and brings that price down, or China buys more and brings the US price up. In simplistic terms, that's true, but this is not simplistic. This is very complicated, and it's very political as well. We'll talk more about that. Here's what's happening in the EU. The EU hog price is now up 40% from a year ago. The price in Denmark is up 50% from a year ago. You can see there the Russian ban that stopped EU pork to Russia crashed the market. Then China began buying in 2016, propped up the market, slowed down. Look where we are today with ASF. It's happening. Inflation is now circling the world because of China's ASF problems. So, currently in China, 50% of the swine herd is gone. That's a guess. My official estimate is by January 1st, 65% of the herd will be gone. No one knows. We'll never know how many hogs there are in China or were in China. It's unknowable. Like I said, there's 42 million hog farmers. Who knows how many hogs? But we know that the losses are massive. Massive. I've talked to veterinarians that operate in China, do consulting work in China. I had a veterinarian tell me in certain provinces of China, 90% of the hogs are gone in some areas. This has completely ravaged China. 22 million sows gone. For reference, the U.S. has about 6 million sows. 1/4 of the global swine herd at least is gone, maybe 1/3. So, the disease rages on. No vaccines, possibly for years. You saw in the news probably researchers from the U.S. government, or operating at the U.S. government side in Plum Island, New York, said we have had a breakthrough. We think we have a vaccine that may work. I've been talking to a lot of scientists this week and this year. That vaccine, if that works, what they're claiming, will take at least 2 years, maybe 3 years, before it could be commercially viable. And they're not certain yet that it can work. Vaccine is not going to save China. It's too late. Hog profits right now above $300 a head in China. Now, as an economist, I can tell you the cure to high prices is high prices, right? When high prices come, everyone expands. In China, everyone's trying to expand, but the virus is very, very dense in China. So people are taking risks. $300 a head on market pigs, that is life-changing money if you're a Chinese villager. Everyone wants to roll the dice. Everyone's trying to restock hogs. It's making the outbreaks worse. People aren't waiting after the farm. They should wait. The government says wait 6 months, disinfect before you restock. $300 a head profit, restock. Try it, right? Everyone's trying it. We're moving hogs all over the marketplace. They're now breeding their market gilts. They're not even waiting for genetics. Breed the market gilts, see what happens. The outbreaks are still very, very bad in China. Repopulation is not succeeding. I've talked to a couple of farms that said we have successfully repopulated. You may count them on one hand. It's very small, the success in repopulating. But everyone's willing to try because the profits are so big. So, here's what the Chinese government is willing to admit to. 40% of the herd gone, 40% of the sows gone. Again, this is the government that's only reported 200 cases so far. So we know it's much worse than what the government has said. So what does this do today in China? Shortages. You can see this on social media. You can see the videos of them fighting over pork at the counters. Many of the counters have no pork. It's scarce to see pork in the marketplace in those key areas of China today. Contacts on the ground tell me that. We go to the store, no pork, or a little bit of pork. Very expensive. The government's trying to help. They've put 30,000 tons of pork into the market. That sounds like a lot of pork. That's about 5 hours of consumption in China. Just yesterday, the Chinese government said we're going to put another 40,000 tons on the market. That's not enough. I think the Chinese government has put much more than they've reported of frozen inventory on the market. I think they're trying to stabilize. Inflation is a huge concern in China. It's actually affecting the CPI. China's CPI jumped to 4.5% in November. Very concerning to the Chinese government and to the global financial markets. So, that food inflation is now soaring. But remember, consumer pressure is different in China. What I mean by that, if this happened in Canada or the US, we would have politicians saying, we will fix this, we'll do whatever it takes, we'll fix this. But you got to remember, in China, no one is running for re-election. There's no elections, right? And so the government can say, yeah, there's less pork, you're going to have to deal with it. And they are. They're going to have to deal with it. The problem with pork, and why this is such a big deal, it affects every person in China. The Hong Kong protests, the US trade war, that doesn't affect every person in China every day. Hyperinflation on pork affects every person in China every day. It's now become a huge issue. The government is very concerned. I don't think the government truly has a grasp yet of how bad it really is. So, here's the prices. China meat and poultry prices. This is a market price. You go into the markets to buy pork, consumer prices. Consumer price inflation of pork was up 125% last month. That's a huge number. Every person in China feels that. Beef prices up 23%. Poultry prices up 27%. Those prices are all record high or near record high. The pork price came down for a couple weeks. It's now going back up. Record high prices. Keep in mind, China lives on 1/6 of our income. So here's the hog price in China. We didn't realize how high it could go how quickly. The previous record high was 21.8 RMB. 21.8. We blew past 21.8 and said maybe 30. A lot of Chinese analysts said, it could go to 30. We went to 40 very quickly. You can see there the price break. That was right after the October inflation data came out. It showed food prices spiraling. It showed the CPI increase. That's why I say I think the Chinese government tried to stabilize the markets, used a lot of frozen inventory to try and control inflation. But the problem is now the price is now going back up. I think we will see new highs by Chinese New Year. January 25th, I think we'll see a new high on that chart. So let's look at the prices. 35 RMB or 35 RMB per kilo, that's the hog price. That's $223 US per hundredweight live, or $297 on a carcass weight. So our weighted average hog price is $60, $60 US, $297 in China. If we look at the cutout, the US cutout at $82 last week, we add 62% tariffs from the US, we can land that pork at $157 on a carcass weight basis. The economics work. The market says send the pork, right? Politics say not so fast. We have problems. We'll see if those get resolved or not, but politics are what's keeping that spread very, very wide. So in the end, what do we come up with China? We end up with a gap, a massive supply gap. 32 million tons. Now that's on a carcass weight equivalent. Most data, trade data, is in a shipped weight equivalent, but USDA reports in a carcass weight equivalent. So on a shipped weight basis, it's a 24 million ton gap. What's going to fill the gap? This has been the question on everyone's mind. Will it be poultry? Will it be beef? Will it be seafood? How will China fill this gap? I have done all of the math I can do to fill this gap. You know what will fill this gap? Nothing. Nothing will fill this gap. You can see my increase in imports, the orange area. So I increase imports 274%, another 3 million tons of pork going in. Still, the gap is massive. Nothing will fill the gap. So what happens? Markets allocate scarce resources with price. Those with money will have pork. 600 million peasant villagers, probably not going to have much pork. And so then the question becomes, are there riots? No, not in China. That's a very, very serious decision in China, whether to riot. I don't think there are riots. I think people will go with less. People can live with much less protein. India has 1.4 billion people that eat very, very little protein. The Chinese villagers are going to eat much less protein this year. So can they get it from the global markets? 24 million ton shortage, there's 9 million tons traded worldwide of pork, and China already buys 2 million tons of that. So where can they go to get pork here? Well, you've got to outbid Japan, you've got to go outbid Mexico, you've got to outbid Canada, US, Korea. There's not much pork to go after, not when the gap is that large. So what about other proteins? Most people say, well, poultry. China will go to poultry. We can produce poultry quickly. Poultry will offset this. One, the supplies are very small. That is the lowest poultry consumption of any major nation on earth. China eats very little poultry, 18 pounds. It's considered a peasant food. Now, they love chicken paws, chicken feet, but breast meat, I never even see breast meat in the marketplace. I see some whole birds, but poultry is not a good option. Beef is very expensive and very small supplies, and you cannot expand beef production quickly. Seafood, of course, there's seafood, but you can't offset 40 pounds of pork with seafood. Think about this when we talk about poultry. Here's the price spread between live hogs and broiler chickens. Look at that price spread. Historically, 2 RMB, 5 RMB. Today, 20 RMB. Huge price spread. How bad do the Chinese hate chicken? I look at this and go, really? Broiler prices can't go up. No one wants the chicken. It's just not a highly sought after item. I think the Chinese are chasing beef harder than they're chasing chicken right now. Bids for Australian, New Zealand beef are record high. China will import $12 billion of beef this year. That's more than they will in pork in dollars. So the question is, how does China fight this and how do they recover? Here's the market. 85% of their production comes from farms less than 1,000 head. Less than 1,000 head. So the Chinese government, when they come out and say, here's what we'll do, we'll give subsidies to our big farms, the big commercial farms, and they will expand and the backyard farms will go out of business. Well, that's maybe a good strategy. The problem is those big farms are only 15% of production. It would take years, a decade, maybe more. I don't think they can ever pull that off. The fragmented nature of the industry ensures that ASF is going to be a problem for a long time, especially without a vaccine. So, how and when does China recover? I don't think they ever do, not to 100%. China has never been globally competitive in pork. Why rebuild an entire industry that you're really not competitive in? They're going to see, and they're learning now, how much cheaper imported pork is anyway. Large-scale farms, you can't grow fast enough. And finishing space is the bottleneck. So if you look at the big farms in China, Wen's Group, Muyan, Shangwei, the big hog farmers in China, they all own sow operations, sow barns. There are no big integrated sow barns that also own all their finishing. So the Chinese investors say, we build sow farms, we'll build bigger sow farms. The problem is, for every sow space you build, you've got to build 15 to 20 finishing spaces. The finishing is done by contracting with small farmers. Most of the hogs finished in China are finished on small grower operations, not the big corporate operations. And so the hogs have to move. You have to use trucks. That's where the exposure to the virus is. It's much easier to build sow farms than it is to build finishing space at 15 to 1 or 20 to 1. That's a major bottleneck. So let's go down the road, 5 years, let's assume we have a vaccine's been found, it works, they're starting to do it. They still have to source 20 to 30 million sows. They need new genetics, new farms, new concrete, new infrastructure. So let's say they get the vaccine. So let's say 10 years from now that they have rebuilt 70% of what they had before. That would be an incredible task. But let's say they do that. That means 30% is still outsourced. And the Chinese government may say, we're okay with that. We don't need to be 100% self-sufficient. Maybe they set a target of 70, hypothetically. If they do, that means 16 million tons needs to be imported. I just showed you total global exports of pork are 8.5 million tons. At 70% rebuild, they still need 16 million tons of imports, twice what's being exported worldwide. I don't know where this goes. No one knows where this is going. But I can tell you the numbers are staggering, and it's going to change everything in the global swine sector for years to come. So, all roads lead to China. China's always been protectionist. The Forbidden City, the Great Wall, all these things have been made to protect, to keep people out of China. But the reality is, all roads will lead to China going forward for protein. They have been approving every nation they can find on earth, approving them to send protein to China. They recently approved Slovenia for pork, Ireland for pork, the UK for beef and pork. They're not going to get much from Ireland, Slovenia, the UK, but they're trying to open every door they can, except for one very big door, the US, right? That's still up for negotiation. But that global inflation is starting to pull protein towards China. So, waves of inflation. The first wave of inflation is in China. That's already over. All of China's protein prices are now record high. Wave 1. Wave 2, everybody that can export to China. I told you, EU hog prices are up 40%. Brazilian hog prices are up over 30% from a year ago. Wave 2 is here. I'll talk about you can argue that the US market is inflating because of China already. So wave 2 is everybody that can ship. It's Brazilian beef, it's Australian beef, New Zealand beef. All of that is wave 2. Wave 2 is here. Wave 3 is not yet here. Wave 3 is those global exporters that don't have access to China. U.S. beef, Canadian beef, we're restricted on what we can send to China. We don't have good access. But Japan is going to see higher prices. Korea is going to see higher prices. We're going to see more Canadian U.S. beef going to Japan and Korea. That'll be wave 3. Wave 4, everyone else. Seafood, tilapia. Wave 4 may not happen for another year, but it will happen. You can't take out this much of the global protein supply without seeing global inflation spread around the world. Now, what happens when we see global protein inflation? Inflation does what? It sends a very strong signal to producers. And you hog farmers are probably asking yourselves, should I be expanding, right? Should I be getting ready for this? We are seeing a strong expansion signal around the world. And so the question becomes, where? Who expands? Who is in the best situation to expand protein production? And so what we did, we went through the top 4 protein producers worldwide, China, EU, US, and Brazil, and we ranked them, just objectively ranked them based on land, capital, permitting, feed, labor, and access to the Chinese market. So you look at this chart and you say, who is best suited to expand? Pretty clear, right? Brazil is in the best spot, mainly because of their access to China. They have a wonderful relationship with China. Now, if the U.S. were to get access to China, and that last square turns green instead of red, then that changes the equation for the U.S. But what I'm saying here, there are limited opportunities around the world to significantly expand protein production. The EU is very limited. We're really looking at North America, South America as the best options to expand. So, where is China's demand in the U.S. markets and the Canadian markets? I say the U.S. market, but your market is our market, right? Why are we not seeing higher prices? Let's walk through this. So let's talk about the futures market first. This is hog futures. The USDA weighted average price, that's similar to the CME index. That's the average cash price of U.S. hogs. The green and yellow dots are where the futures contracts are. So I'm standing here today telling you that 1/3 of the world swine herd may be gone. Inflation is going through the roof everywhere on earth, and that's what the futures market is? The futures market says, no story here. Why is that? Couple of answers. One is, you face enormous risk when you put one of those positions on, because you're saying, okay, let's assume China's going to buy much, much more pork from the U.S., so we go buy futures. There's enormous upside potential, but what if we find a case of ASF in North America? Then there's enormous downside risk on the market. And so we have a situation where no one's really comfortable bidding that market up and taking positions on the outright contracts, because while there is upside risk, there's also downside risk. So how do we trade this? Look at the options. The futures options show what's going on much better than the contracts do. Here's my carnival game. You've all been to a state fair. There's the carnival. I have a son who is 12 years old. He worked on a farm this summer. He earned money. We went to the fair. He wanted to spend all his money playing the ring toss game, where you throw the rings over the bottle and you win a very cheap stuffed animal. And he thought, this is great. And I said, this is a great lesson. Spend all your money, right? Here's my carnival game for you guys. It looks very simple. Can you predict June lean hog futures within a $100 range? That's a big range. Hog futures, $75, $80. I'll give you a $100 range. If you can pick where June hog futures lands within a $100 window, say from 50 to 150. I mean, we're in December. It's not that far off. If you can pick it in a $100 range, the market will pay you $230 today. You can call Chicago and do this right now. You go sell a $150 call and you go sell a $50 put. And they will credit your account with $230. And as long as the market closes between those two, you get to keep it. Now here's the deal. If it goes above 150, you have to front the difference. If it goes below 50, you have to front the difference. See what I mean? It's like the ring toss game. It looks very simple, and you say, why aren't we all doing this? And then you go to do it, and you go, what if? What if? So there's huge option volatility. While the futures don't show it in the options market, there's a 170 call trading in June hogs. Someone is worried about being covered at 170. It's trading at $78, $75 today. 170 call. You can go sell that if you want to put some money in your pocket. Now you got to stand the risk above 170. I think you're probably okay there. But again, there's a lot of risk in these markets. So, why the low prices? This is what the U.S. farmers are saying. Why are my hog prices so low? The spot price, $45 hogs. You've been telling us China is huge all year long and my hogs are worthless. Why? Well, a couple things to consider. This is the cash hog price. Iowa, Minnesota, carcass equivalent spot price. 2% of our U.S. hogs trade on this price. Let's add this price. Our weighted average price captures the majority of our hogs. That's the average price between formula, contract, spot, everything. It's similar to the CME index. So I go, one, your prices aren't $45, even though that's what the news says every day. The average price is $65, $63. And if we want to look the other way, look at our cutout. We have an $82 cutout. That's pretty incredible. But look at that window. From the Iowa, Minnesota price, cutout is almost double. Now, if you look closely at this chart, look at when that spread widens every year. October, November. We can go back and look. October, November, see where that was last year? Look at October, November 2017. Those prices in the summer are almost the same. Look at this last summer. Look at summer, same. We had no spread. But look at October, November. We always have a big spread. Why? Because we have so many hogs in October, November. The packer has way more leverage over the producer in November. There are plenty of hogs. The packers are going, look, we're running at capacity. We don't really need to buy more hogs. And the farmer's going, hey, I got to move hogs because I've got more hogs coming. They say, okay, we'll give you $60, whatever. So you go through this period every year of poor leverage. That's going to change. So look at where we're at right now. In the past 4 weeks, U.S. pork production is up 8%. That is a huge number. We have crammed 8% more pork through the system. We hit all-time record high kills last week, almost 2.8 million. Huge kills. So production's up 8%. The cutout is up 13%. So how do you have the cutout up 13% when you have kills up, production up 8%? That makes no sense. The answer is China. China is buying a lot of U.S. pork and Canadian pork. U.S. ham prices are up 53% from a year ago. Just in the last 8 weeks, ham prices are up 52%. It's happened like that. A big factor in that was Canada getting access back to China. November 5th, China reopened to Canadian pork, and all of a sudden, boom, ham prices went up. When Canada was closed, could not export to China, a lot of hams were going to Mexico. So once that market opened, all of a sudden the ham market tightened, and away we go. U.S. pork exports were up 17% in Q3. The problem is the first half of the year they were only up they were down 5%. So we went from minus 5%, boom. You can see it already happening, right? Likely well above that in November. I think November is going to show a huge export number. China is definitely having an impact on our markets. So, Canada pork exports, you can see there the problems with the China ban. When the China ban took effect, Canadian pork to China collapses. Canadian pork everywhere else increases. To the U.S., to Korea, to Mexico, to the Philippines, all others. Has to go somewhere. The harsh reality of the pork business is it's a sell it or smell it business, right? You either sell it or you smell it. And so it's got to go somewhere, and the price clears it. And so that price fell and product went. Now with China reopening to Canada, a lot of Canadian pork, I think, is moving very quickly to Canada now because you don't have the retaliation tariffs that U.S. pork has. So hopefully, this is painful to think about, but hopefully that moves enough pork out of Canada that it affects the U.S. price and raises the U.S. price so that your price will go up, right? So, looking into 2020, how do you even begin to forecast pork exports in 2020? That's an actual picture of me trying to figure out. It's like alchemy or something. It's very difficult to forecast where we're going to be. So I start with China and I say, how much pork can China buy from the world? I think they're going to be up about 3 million tons next year. The EU is going to send the most. US is going to send a lot. Brazil's going to send a lot. Everybody's going to send a lot. So say that China can get 3 million tons. And we back that into what that means. Depends on politics, right? I have no idea when the trade deal is going to be done to lift U.S. tariffs on pork. But here's what happens. With 50% tariffs on U.S. pork, retaliation tariffs, 50%, regular tariffs, 12%, that means only the state-owned enterprises can really come buy U.S. pork. So SOEs like COFCO, they come buy U.S. pork. Is COFCO paying the tariff in China? I don't know, maybe not. But it's irrelevant because they are the government. So whether the government's paying the tariff to themselves or not doesn't matter. But when there's this big tariff, the private companies say, we're going to buy European pork or Canadian pork. We're not going to mess with the U.S. And so we have COFCO that comes into our market once every 3 or 4 or 5 weeks and books huge out-front orders. They don't wreck our price. They don't drive the price up in the spot market, but they book everything they can out front. Now, if those tariffs go away, the phones start ringing, and there will be many Chinese companies calling saying, we want U.S. pork, because that pork is going to turn to gold as it crosses the ocean. Right now, we only have the SOEs really actively buying, but if the tariffs get lifted, that changes very quickly. What about the art of the deal, right? The question is, who wants this deal done? President Trump wants some type of phase one agreement. He needs some type of victory to show. I don't think he really wants the trade war over, because he can go campaign for the next year and he can go say China, 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 taking advantage of us, ripping us off, the Democrats won't deal with China, I'll fight China. I think it makes a great campaign punching bag for Trump's base. So I'm not sure he wants a deal. The Chinese strategy all along has been to delay. Delay, delay, delay. They know they will outlive Trump. They don't know if it's 1 year or 5 years, but they know they're going to outlive Trump. And so their strategy is to delay. And it sounds like they may have got it done. We just heard this week that they may delay the tariffs. So if both sides want to delay, what does that tell us? Probably no deal anytime soon. This is going to go on and on and on. Who knows? But they have enormous pressure to try and solve inflation. The reality is U.S. pork isn't going to fix the inflation problem. The gap is too big. But they definitely have pressure to try and provide pork. So here's my forecast. I went with 3 scenarios. Scenario 1 is we continue with political friction, the tariffs remain, and prices stay above 30 RMB. Scenario 2, the friction is eased, the tariffs are lifted, and prices stay above 30 RMB. And scenario 3 is imports are highly sought. All the games are over, send everything you got. So I'm going with scenario 2 for my forecast, which you can see shows a 164% increase. That's a huge increase on U.S. pork exports. I'm forecasting U.S. pork exports up 28% next year. USDA is saying up 12%. This is a bold forecast, but get this. That number right there, that says we send 8% of U.S. production to China next year. On a weekly basis right now, we're sending 8% of U.S. production to China right now. And we still have Tyson and JBS are coming on board racto-free January, February. That hasn't even started yet. We're already sending 8% of production to China. This forecast could be too low. There's the quarterly numbers. My key assumption is that we work our way through the tariffs. We do not have tariffs. For this to happen, we've got to have the tariffs lifted. That's a big if, right? So, it all sounds so wonderful and so positive, and farmers are so anxious and excited to expand, and then I bring this slide up. This is where I hold this beautiful live puppy up on stage, and then I just go and kill it. This is the downside risk. What if we find ASF in North America? Here's the scenario. Export markets close instantly. Even China, even if they need pork. Look what they did to Belgium. They still won't open to Belgian pork. Every market closes. Canada, Mexico, the US, we could do some regionalization. But I think once we find that case, we can't even really regionalize until we know, one, where did it go? Where's that case? Did we contain it? It takes us weeks to really identify where did the hogs go to from that farm? Where did trucks go from that farm? It may take 2 weeks before USDA can say, okay, we definitively know, here it is, we got our arms around it, contained it. That's best case scenario. So for 2 weeks, we have 23% too much pork. Way too much pork. It overwhelms the system. For 2 weeks, hog futures go limit down. Cattle futures go limit down. We get overwhelmed in pork. Even if we isolate it, find out, and identify it. Canada exports 68% of production. You guys know the risks. Many of those markets stay closed. Does China stay closed? Possibly. When BSE hit, we said The Japanese need our beef. Japan needs beef. They've got to have it. We were half of their beef imports. It took 3 years to get that market reopened. What does China do? China bans U.S. pork, watches the price go down, 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 down. And then what do? They book more pork, and eventually they open. Who knows? But they're not going to say, oh, it's okay, we're not going to ban you. They're going to ban us if we find it. Massive culling is not the risk. We're not going to lose 60% of our herd like China did. This virus is not highly contagious. It's not airborne. It's nose to nose. Our biosecurity would make it pretty good to keep it under control. The problem would be exports. So the key things I'm watching as we go through this year, prices all over the world, China especially. What happens in Europe? Does it spread? Caution is warranted to any commodity with exposure to this China ASF problem. I didn't even talk about soybeans. China uses 1/3 of the world's soybean supply for hog feed. Is that going to change? Absolutely, that's going to change. All U.S. access will change the markets instantly. If there's a tweet that tariffs are lifted, look out, that changes it. I'm just going to leave you with one thought here about the future. This is who? Anyone know who this is? Charles Darwin, right? The father of evolution. Father of evolution. And one of his theories that I agree wholeheartedly with is his theory of adaptation. And what he said here, it's not the most intellectual of the species that survives, it's not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one best able to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. I think that's a great message for us in the swine sector, and especially in the Canadian swine sector, the pork sector, is your industry has done a fantastic job of navigating very difficult situations. And the ability to adapt is what is going to ensure your survival and your success. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks, Brett. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you, Brett. What a massive dose of market intel. Definitely those trips to China, they are worth the plane tickets. On a le temps d'une, peut-être deux questions.
We have time for maybe 2 questions for Brett. Please come up to the microphone if you wish to ask a question. Okay, the question will come from me then. So, Brett?
A little more about long-term demand in China. Do you see any structural change, or do you expect any structural change from the current prices?
Yeah, good question. Absolutely. We will see demand destruction. Consumers just simply cannot pay these amounts and will not pay these amounts. The question, though, your question's a good question. Long term, what does this do? And people look at China and say, when do they get back to normal? I don't think there is a normal. I don't think they ever get back to normal. I think in the future, Chinese will eat more beef and more poultry than they have in the past, mainly beef. I don't think they go back to 88 pounds of pork consumption, maybe ever, just because the diet changed, those prices change behavior. And especially over a long term, I think demand is lost in China.
Brett, thank you. We already look forward to your next visit in Quebec City.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Brett Stuart, mesdames et messieurs.